In the history of warfare, victory is often defined by innovation and adaptation. But what happens when the opposite is true? When rigid thinking, institutional pride, and a refusal to see the writing on the wall lead to disaster? In World War II, even the navies that ultimately won the war made decisions so dogmatic they paid a staggering price. Today, we'll explore how this institutional stubbornness broke fleets, wasted lives, and reshaped naval warfare forever. Let's start with 4Z, a British naval contingent sent to Singapore. It sailed under a complete misjudgment of Japanese air power. Admiral Tom Phillips, its commander, discounted the threat of low-level torpedo attacks. This led to a fundamental failure to appreciate how land-based aircraft. The Royal Navy was still wedded to the idea that massive battleships ruled the waves. An anomaly, not the paradigm shift. It truly was. To make matters worse, political pressure from Winston Churchill forced the deployment of these ships without any proper air cover. The result was inevitable. On December 10, 1941, both the mighty HMS Prince of Wales and the battlecruiser HMS Repulse were sunk by Japanese aircraft. A single torpedo crippled the Prince of Wales's propeller shaft, causing catastrophic flooding and a complete loss of control. The Repulse skillfully evaded many attacks but was eventually overwhelmed by the sheer number of torpedoes. What could have been done differently? Without air cover, 4Z should have stayed south of Singapore, acting as a fleet and being. This would have forced Japan to divert significant resources to watch them, without risking their outright destruction. Simple things could have made a difference. Integrated RAF fighter direction teams, shared radio procedures, and breaking radio silence once they were detected anyway. These could have disrupted the Japanese torpedo attacks, while Singapore itself likely would have still fallen. Preserving those two capital ships would have significantly influenced the naval balance in 1942. Once refitted with better anti-aircraft guns, they could have strengthened the Allied presence in the Indian Ocean, forcing Japan to overextend its forces across Southeast Asia. Instead, their shocking loss became the final, bloody punctuation mark on an era. Next, we turn to the German Kriegsmarine and their unbreakable faith in the Enigma machine. They operated under the core assumption that Enigma provided absolute cryptographic security. So, when Allied forces started having uncanny success against their U-boats, the Germans misattributed it to everything else. Lucky visual sightings, espionage, or superior Allied radar. They never considered that their codes were being systematically broken. German naval intelligence, Bedienste, had successfully broken some Allied convoy ciphers, which, ironically, reinforced their own sense of security. They just assumed their encryption was equally, if not more, effective. Most critically, they simply couldn't grasp the industrial scale of code-breaking happening at Bletchley Park. German cryptographers knew that an Enigma machine might be captured, but they believed the sheer mathematical complexity of its settings made timely decryption impossible. The Enigma's key space was seen as a theoretical fortress. Roughly 75% of the entire U-boat fleet was sunk during the war, and their defeat wasn't due to a single magic bullet. It was a combined, Allied system. It was routing convoys around German wolf packs before they could even attack. High-frequency direction finding, or HFDUF, turned the U-boat's own radio transmissions into targeting data. New centimetric radar defeated their stealth, and long-range aircraft closed the mid-Atlantic gap, where they had once roamed freely. The very tactic that made the Wolfpack's effective heavy radio traffic to coordinate attacks became their downfall, exposing them to detection. Could they have adapted Perhaps? An earlier investment in burst transmission systems could have shortened their RADIO. Signals below the threshold of interception. Had Enigma remained secure, the Battle of the Atlantic would have been far more costly for the Allies. A longer war might have led to a complete Soviet occupation of Germany or even atomic bomb strikes on German cities, while cryptographic adaptation could have delayed the collapse. Now, let's look at the U.S. Navy and one of the biggest scandals of the war, the Mark 14 torpedo. This weapon was plagued by 3 compounding defects, each one masking the others. Once that was finally corrected, its Mark 6 magnetic exploder proved to be dangerously unstable, often detonating prematurely. But even when both of those issues were fixed, it was discovered that the contact exploder, the part that should have gone off when it hit a ship, was also defective, failing to detonate even on perfect, perpendicular impacts. This scandal persisted for years due to bureaucratic ego within the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance. In a misguided attempt to save money, they'd avoided live-fire testing before the war, relying instead on flawed theoretical models. When submarine commanders in the field reported failure after failure, for nearly 2 years, U.S. submarines were rendered almost completely combat ineffective. During the desperate defense of the Philippines, American subs launched repeated attacks against Japanese invasion fleets, but achieved almost no results. They failed to disrupt Japanese landings, despite having ample targets. In many theaters, submarines were the only Allied assets available, yet their defective torpedoes allowed Japanese supply lines to function largely unmolested. What was the solution? It was simply, but bureaucratically resisted. It took Rear Admiral Lockwood's unauthorized net tests in 1942 to finally prove the depth error, leading to a simple mechanical recalibration. The magnetic exploder should have been disabled much earlier once its instability became clear, and the contact exploder's failures could have been identified with simple impact tests against a cliff face. With functional torpedoes early in the war, Japanese merchant shipping would have suffered severe losses by late 1942, accelerating the resource starvation of their war machine. Reinforcement routes like the Tokyo Express would have faced far higher attrition, weakening Japanese positions in the Solomon Islands. An earlier fix would have hastened Japan's economic collapse and likely shortened the entire war by several months. Another American failure occurred right off its own shores. The massive U.S. East Coast shipping losses in early 1942 were a catastrophic result of the German Operation Paukenschlag. Merchant ships sailed completely unescorted, brightly silhouetted against the lights of coastal cities. This created a perfect shooting gallery for German U.S. The Navy lacked the legal power to impose blackouts. The Army resisted dimouts over civilian morale concerns, and local governments opposed them for economic reasons. The U.S. Navy, under the command of Admiral Ernest King, rigidly adhered to an offensive doctrine. He believed that poorly escorted convoys were just larger targets and preferred sending out independent anti-submarine patrols. Despite the proven success of the British convoy system, inter-service rivalry made things worse. This period became known to the Germans as the Second Happy Time. Over 600 Allied ships were sunk, with roughly 400 of them in American waters. The losses grew as more Type 7 U-boats were joined by long-range Type IXs, supported by tanker submarines, called milk cows. Only after defenses finally improved in May 1942 did the U-boats shift their operations south to the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. The U.S. needed a layered coastal defense from the very beginning. Earlier and more forceful civil-military coordination could have enforced blackouts despite the political resistance. The rapid deployment of small escort vessels, even armed yachts and fishing boats, a faster acceptance of British and Canadian escorts and their hard-won expertise would have accelerated the implementation of convoy protection and drastically reduced those early losses. Even small coastal convoys would have ended the easy surface attacks and saved hundreds of ships and thousands of lives without diverting destroyers from vital troop transport duties. Finally, we examine the fatal flaw of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were doctrinally trapped by the concept of kantai. In this mindset, protecting merchant shipping was seen as a secondary, defensive, and unglamorous task, not a strategic lifeline. As a result, Japanese convoys were largely unescorted early in the war. There was a powerful institutional bias that favored offensive prestige over defensive logistics. Escort duty was considered career poison. All the best talent was funneled into battleships and aircraft carriers, while anti-submarine units were staffed by second-rate officers. To compound this failure, intense inter-service rivalry meant the Army and Navy ran their own separate merchant fleets and refused to create a unified command structure to protect them. The consequences were devastating. By late 1944, Japan still possessed powerful warships like the super battleship Yamato, but lacked the fuel to even send them out to sea. Tanker losses crippled the fleet's mobility, culminating in symbolic suicide missions like the Yamato's final voyage. Industrial collapse followed as the American submarine blockade tightened. Operation Starvation, an aerial mining campaign, further slashed Japan's usable merchant tonnage down to roughly 1 million tons. triggering near-famine conditions among the civilian population. Japan needed an early, strategic pivot toward logistics. Construction of escort ships and tankers should have replaced super battleship programs in the late 1930s. A portion of their naval air power should have been permanently allocated to convoy protection rather than being consumed in attritional offensive campaigns. Of course, an effective escort doctrine would not have secured victory for Japan, but it could have prolonged their resistance. Sustained shipping would have preserved fuel and raw material flows. The Allied submarine campaign would have faced higher costs and slower progress, while the atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion remained the decisive final blows. A functional merchant marine could have delayed Japan's collapse, possibly altering the strategic situation prior to their surrender. These stories show us that in war, the greatest enemy can sometimes be found within one's own command structure. Dogma, ego, and a refusal to adapt can be just as destructive as any enemy weapon.